Welcome to the Human 24 Live on Form podcast. This is a conversation with the people we have encountered and met across our lives. People who have and are still inspiring us with their journeys, an ongoing pursuit to fulfill their potential. Experts in their given fields, legacy builders, and people who strive to perform at their very best every moment of every day. We dig into their hows, their whys, what fuels their purpose, and what their ingrained daily habits are that ensure structure continues to defeat chaos. We hope you enjoy. Okay, so today on the Live on Form podcast, we are joined by James Barber. James is the lead performance specialist at the Altitude Centre in London. James, how are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Really good to be on. I was saying, seeing kind of some of the guests that you've had on before, it's lovely to be talking to you today. Yeah, how are you doing?
Excellent. So lots of oxygen around, which is good.
Yeah, there is at the moment. Yeah,
which we'll dig into and talk about. So altitude training has been around a long time, hasn't it? Do you want to give us a little bit of history of altitude training and where it came about and et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. I mean, I always kind of like to imagine that altitude training was kind of invented by the ancient Greeks. They used to send their fighters up into the mountains to train before they go to war. But I don't think that really passes for much in elite sport these days. So it kind of comes from the Mexico Olympics, 68. They basically realized that everyone who was trying to run long distances was running much slower than they usually would. And everyone who was trying to sprint ran much more quickly than they would, or throw or jump. They could do it much better than they would previously. And they realized very quickly that was due to thin air, which is very good if you're very good for performance. If you're trying to go as quickly as you can over 100 meters, there's less air resistance. But if you're trying to get lots of oxygen in and run 10,000 meters on the track, it's not so good for that. And so the times at 68 were about 10% slower than they would be than they were at the Olympic Games either side of Mexico City. But what they also realized was that it was really kind of the rise of the East Africans and those who kind of heralded from altitude in the first place, and they were able to cope with the low oxygen environment that they found at altitude. And so they thought, hey, look, there's something in this. We need to be training at altitude to prepare for sports performance. And then as we kind of got into it, realized that actually many of the adaptations that allow us to deal with altitude more quickly actually are just good for general endurance performance at first, but then more recently we found that actually it's good in kind of repeat sprint type sports and for general health and well-being as well. So it's kind of exploded in the last 40, 50 years, but then particularly in the last maybe 10, 12 years, we've had a real shift in terms of how we're actually viewing altitude training from that time, which is really cool. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about today.
Yeah, the Mexico thing is intriguing because around that time, there was a lot of exercise physiologists around. There was a lot of people who understood all this stuff. And then, it just dawned on them when all of a sudden all these anomalies as such started to show up with respect to, certain numbers going up and certain numbers going down. So it was fascinating kind of how it came about. I'm sure there is something to do with the Greek mythology. There must be something, I'm sure.
I quite like it. I think it lends a certain romanticism to it anyway, which you don't necessarily get in sports science these days.
Yeah, they seem to cotton onto a lot of stuff when it came to athletic performance way before their time. I just don't think that sometimes it maybe wasn't documented. So we'll stick with that story that it was ancient Greeks, Persians, or whatever it might be, warriors, let's say. So
let's say with that.
So you work at the Altitude Centre, which is obviously it is what it is, right? It couldn't be a better explanation of what it is. So the whole premise is that you have a number of modalities and ways in which somebody can simulate an altitude environment, a low oxygen environment, right?
Yeah. So look, I mean, I think so. It's almost taking a step back from there. Traditionally, altitude training has meant going to the mountains for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks at a time. Which is great if you're an Olympic athlete and you've got time in your training calendar to do that, but it's not feasible for everybody. So what sort of was realized with the technology that was developed kind of through the 70s and 80s mostly was that actually the reason we want to go to altitude is that we want to expose our bodies to hypoxia, or a lack of oxygen in the air, it's not the altitude per se. It's not the fact that we're at 2,000 meters. It's the fact that there's less oxygen in the air at 2,000 meters, which is important. And so kind of, the people who are looking at this at the time, they kind of thought, well, maybe we can simulate this in some way. And so that's exactly what we can do. And so actually we can just at sea level basically have rooms which are controlled by hypoxic generators, and they essentially take air from outside, remove some of the oxygen from it, and then feed it into a room which you then train in. And so if that original modality of altitude training was called live high, train high, because you literally went to the mountains, lived high at altitude for several weeks, trained at altitude for several weeks, what we can do is simulate altitude so that people can be living at sea level, but they're, we're in London, so you can be living in London, but then step into the altitude chamber to train high for, it could be a 20-minute repeat sprint session, it could be a 3-hour endurance session, but it's only a short period of time in the scheme of things. So we do most of our training on site is in that respect. We can also use these generators with sleep tents, and that's something that's very popular in endurance training. Particularly is to actually take a hypoxic generator, which again is just taking air from the room that it's in, removing some of the oxygen from that air, and then feeding that air into a tent which is over a bed. And so people sleep at altitude even though they're still in London or wherever, and then they step outside and do their training at sea level. And we call that live high, train low, because you're spending a significant amount of time at altitude. You're essentially living high by sleeping high, but training low because you're still training at sea level, and you haven't ultimately had to go to the mountains. So kind of three main ways of looking at altitude. And obviously we're specializing, in those simulated altitude methods, which and basically making those available to anyone is the key thing.
And obviously in amongst that, you've got live high, train high, right, as well, where you sleep, you train, you do. And theoretically, I guess you could have somebody who literally lives in the altitude center and utilizes both, right?
Yeah, so we have people who will have our generators at home, and so they'll be sleeping in an altitude tent. Most of the time we'll do the programming for that, so it won't be every night, but a lot of the time they'll spend a lot of time at altitude, and then use the generator to train high as well, hook it up to a turbo trainer, do their weights on a treadmill, whatever it is, and pretty much simulating living high and training high, but without having to go abroad for extended periods of time, which is great.
Sure, and I think the public's attention has been drawn to this just recently with 14 Peaks, which was obviously Nim's time, hitting up 14 of the 8,000 feet. Am I right in feet? Aren't I? 8,000 meters. I was going to say 8,000 feet. Doesn't sound a lot. 8,000 meters. So the 14 peaks across, and that's all of them, right? There isn't any more.
Yeah, no more. Yeah, he did all of them, and I think that's enough, really, to be honest with you.
Yeah. I mean, it's an incredible documentary about it, but it doesn't really get too much into hypoxia. It talks about the consequence almost of it, and there's a few incidences where he's talking about the fact that he scaled was it K2 without oxygen, which was quite a significant thing. Was it K2 he did?
Yeah, so I mean, he's I think for most of them they're using oxygen at some point, but then it becomes very difficult around managing your oxygen, particularly with some of the rescues that he's had to do, where he's had to spend more time at the higher altitudes than expected. So you end up with less oxygen than you expected, or you have to manage how you're using it in that respect anyway. And just getting into trouble there. But yeah, I mean, we did a little bit of work with NIMS on that one and kind of understanding how he responds to altitude. And I think that's one of the things, it's interesting that's one of the first things that you pick up on, because so often we think of altitude training as being this thing for elite sports people. You think of, some of the athletes that we've worked with, people who have won the British riders who have won the Tour de France, British Olympians, all those sorts of people. You think of that, but actually it's also really for people who are going to altitude as much as anything else. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to understand what allowed him to do what he does. So kind of putting him through a series of tests, understanding how he responds to altitude, and then actually from that understanding what it is that makes him able to do what he does, and how we can then use the facilities, the expertise that we have to actually improve people's response to altitude and bring them kind of in line with him. So if people are going off to climb whether it's base camp, Kilimanjaro, those sorts of things, or going to 8,000 meter peaks, we can actually use the equipment that we have to then pre-acclimatize people as well, to understand what they're doing at the moment and then to pre-acclimatize them. So it kind of ties that in as well, which I think people often don't think about with altitude training.
And I'm guessing it's a sliding scale, is it? As to, obviously if you go to base camp, it's a different tolerance to if you go into 8,000 meters. And was there an overreach in there with, for example, people like Nims? Was there an overreach in there where you would almost train him to tolerate 10,000 meters, 12,000 meters? Is there an element of that, or do you just go, right, it's 8,000 tops, that's as thin as it's going to get, or do you overstep that mark?
No, I memean, you can only really physically acclimatize a human to 6,500 meters. Anything above that, the body will start to degrade. It just will start to degrade. We can't cope with that. And ultimately, he'll be using oxygen above those heights anyway. Most people climbing at those altitudes these days will be using supplementary oxygen. It doesn't make it like it doesn't. It's not so much oxygen that it's as though they're at sea level. It's still very restricted, but they'll be using some supplementary oxygen as well. So we basically, what we want to do with anyone climbing over 6,000 meters is we want to get them as comfortable as possible at 6 or 6,500 meters, and then anything over that becomes a stretch. So if we can get someone just sitting at 6,000 meters and they're chilling as though they're at sea level, their blood oxygen saturation's over 95%, their resting heart rate is super low, which is obviously a relative term, but their resting heart rate is as low as it possibly can be, then we've got their altitude physiology to a point where they're basically at sea level. Their body almost isn't seeing the altitude, which is kind of going to be the goal for anyone who's then going higher, because it just means that it's got an effect of them kind of going up from there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's fascinating how he's learned to tolerate this, but over the period of time that he did it was unreal, right? And I'm guessing that kind of adaptation and being able to repeat those, I think we've lost you. You frozen. I think we lost you there momentarily. You were frozen.
Yeah, I'm with you now.
No worries. And obviously repeating that performance, I was just saying about repeating that performance again and again and again in such a short window, because, and then we can go the other way, which again was something I wanted to sort of touch on with you, where we've got a free diver actually lined up that we're going to actually talk about the other way, right? Yeah. So obviously hypoxia, and I haven't looked this up and I should have done, but I'm assuming is it hypoxia? Hypo?
No, it's hypo, HYPO, low oxygen, so literally low oxygen. You can do hyperoxia, which would be lots of oxygen. And some people do that for some things, but it's not something that we do. But yeah, hypoxia, I probably should have defined this at the start, but it's literally just any environment in which there's less oxygen than there would be at sea level. So right now, I'm assuming you're at sea level at the moment, but 21% of the air that you're breathing is oxygen, and we're at kind of a normal sea level air pressure. So right now, although you can't feel it, wherever the listener is in the world, there's a weight of air pushing down on them, which is their air pressure. And so the combination of the 21% oxygen and the very high air pressure means that we have a certain amount of oxygen available to us. What happens when you climb up a mountain is that the air pressure reduces. So although 21% of the air is still oxygen, it's kind of 21% of less air, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then what we do to stimulate that is we keep air pressure the same, but reduce the oxygen concentration. So in our altitude chamber, to simulate 2,700 meters, which we find is the right sweet spot for training versus maintaining quality of training, then we reduce that to 15% oxygen, but keep the pressure constant. So kind of the difference between simulated and actual altitude.
Okay, so just to get my physiological head around this.
Yeah.
So if I was going to a big cave,
if
I was to climb into a cave at 8,000 meters depth, which I don't even know whether they exist. Is there a cave on the planet that's that deep? I would imagine.
You struggle to get to it, that's for sure.
Yeah. If I was to hypothetically what happens then?
Yeah.
So oxygen goes up, or oxygen goes down, or air pressure, or how does it work?
Yeah. So you're kind of dealing with, as you say, the reverse of what we deal with when it comes to altitude, but there you'd have very high air pressure. So you would theoretically have more oxygen available to you, but yeah, you'd also be under the sea and have all sorts of other environmental pressures on you at that point, to be honest with you. But yeah, theoretically, you then have a massive amount of air pressure on you, and you would again theoretically have more oxygen, but you wouldn't really be able. You probably wouldn't be able to cope with that air pressure, and you'd kind of implode. Is the honest answer, but
Yeah.
you know, for hypothetical, yes.
Yeah, you get these. I'm sure there's a few Hollywood movies have depicted such a thing happening.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, it's I mean, again, we gone off on a tangent there, but the plan is to speak to a free diver about very similar sort of environments, but nowhere near the same depth as you go up, right? It's a whole different ballpark. So having used it, so we talk about everyday sort of people using this and utilizing it. So if you've got, you know, average person, weekend warrior, does a bit of exercise, whatever it might be, what are the overlying benefits of them starting to train at altitude, irrespective of whether they're gunning for a statistical performance improvement? Is there health benefits? Are there things that longevity? Is there, you know, I know there's a lot of data with respect to longevity and oxygen, and obviously we understand what happens when you bite into an apple and all of these different things. So, you know, how does it affect the average person?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's loads to it, and I'll give you the headline answer, which is that if you're to do any workout, whether it's HIIT training, low intensity, steady state type training, weight training, whatever, if you do it correctly, you're likely to get more benefit by doing it at altitude than if you did it at sea level. That's kind of a headline answer, but obviously there's going to be more nuance than that. So if you take someone who's looking at losing a bit of weight, for example, maybe they're dealing with, you know, they want to improve their cardiometabolic health, that sort of thing, then what are we dealing with there? We're looking at someone who is potentially overweight and that sort of thing. And so they want to get into running, but running hurts, you know, potentially a little bit of arthritis, pressure on the joints. The mechanical load is high if someone is overweight and they want to get into running. So what if we said, well, actually, let's get you in the altitude chamber on a treadmill and have you walk at altitude, reduce the mechanical loading, reduce the joint loading, the stress on the bones, but still be able to get the heart rate and things like lactate production, which happens during walking if you have someone, you know, exercising intensely enough. If we can still get the kind of cardiometabolic solicitation to be high enough, but just by walking, well, then basically their body, you know, their heart and their lungs have seen a far more intense workout than their joints and their muscles have. So suddenly we're actually getting a good cardiovascular and cardiorespiratory fitness response from a walking intervention, which actually you'd have to have someone running at sea level to achieve those same benefits. And we see that time and again, whether that is in just a general population. We see that certainly in the research in older populations as well. There's some really nice data where we've just had 70-year-olds walking on treadmills, and the only difference, well, not the only difference, but they have them basically walking at the same pace, but the heart rate is much higher for the group that train at altitude. And so they improve things like their VO2 max, which is really important for all-cause mortality and independent living and that sort of thing. So actually improving kind of quality of life outcomes in those sorts of populations is a very real possibility just by walking at altitude in a way that you wouldn't get that benefit from walking at sea level. But then if you start to extend that out, I guess you can kind of go in two opposite directions from that. You might have someone who is hesitant even to get into exercise. And so what we can do is actually just have them breathing very high altitude air for short periods of time. So using one of the hypoxic generators that I was talking about before, we can simulate altitudes up to 6,500 meters. So you say, well, if we can't get someone even walking on a treadmill at 3,000 meters, we can't persuade them to do that. Why don't we get them breathing very high out there And then we start to, just for 5 minutes at a time through a mask, removing the mask for 5 minutes, repeating that through for an hour or so, doing that on a daily basis or every other day, something like that. And then actually we can start to improve again, kind of some of the cardiometabolic type outcomes and the cardiometabolic health. So there are case studies whereby that sort of training has started to reverse pre-diabetes and improve lipid metabolism. And then what we find is that as well, because they started to do that, it's a bit of a gateway behavior into exercise. Through our own research that we've done, actually, if we can get people doing that, then we say, well, the next step is to start walking on a treadmill. So let's do that. So kind of thinking of it from a psychological point of view as much as anything else. Or if we go the other way and we're looking more at a performance side of things, well, we know that actually whether we're whenever we're training, one of the things that is a stimulus for adaptation is local hypoxia in the muscle. That's why people do blood flow restriction training, that sort of thing. So let's create that on a systemic level. Let's create that on a whole body level. So if we've got trained cyclists in there, we've run our own case studies where we've had a group of trained cyclists who are let's say recreational, very serious about their cycling, but they've got full-time jobs, successful careers in the city, and we've taken them and improved their functional threshold power by about 10% in 6 weeks, which is a really big improvement for those sorts of athletes. Just from training sort of 2-3 times a week. So actually, I think it seems like a bit of a nice thing to say that altitude training is for everyone, but it really is for everyone taking those very first steps into any kind of training and looking at those gateway behaviors through then to actually quite serious performance athletes. And we can see more benefit from any given workout if we do it correctly at altitude versus doing it at sea level.
Okay. And just to go on to a bit of a contentious area.
Yeah.
Because logically, everything you've said would make me logically think that this was the correct way of doing it, right? That you probably know where I'm going, right? Is that when you talk about reducing the amount of oxygen that someone is consuming, we've got to consider things like gaseous exchanges, et cetera, et cetera. But the big trend that sort of came about probably 5 or 6 years ago were classed as altitude masks, which is actually counter to sort of what they are, which were these Bane-esque masks that people would wear to exercise in. And the whole idea at the time was we're reducing the amount of oxygen that's available to us, which theoretically is correct, right? But the exchange of gases is very different. The way that they work is very different. And they aptly got named altitude masks for the most part. I think some of them actually advertised quite heavily that these were altitude masks, which, a true altitude mask has to have a bunch of stuff rigged up to it and connected to it. And it's probably infinitely more expensive. But so these masks, tell us about these masks and just explain, the benefits of the misinterpretation of what they're for and how they work, and obviously the kind of gaseous exchange that sort of occurs there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing, and again, I'll give you the headline, is that they've had to rebrand and they can no longer call themselves altitude masks. And I think really that tells you everything you need to know about what I'm about to say, but they don't simulate altitude in any way. You kind of may as well hold your breath in that respect, or breathe a little bit more shallowly. They don't do anything. And it depends how much into the kind of physics actually of altitude rather than the physiology of it that you want to get. But the key thing for altitude is that something called the partial pressure of oxygen is reduced. And that is the combination of the concentration of oxygen in the air, so 21%, multiplied by the barometric pressure, which is usually about 760 millimeters of mercury, something like that. It might be a little bit higher at the moment. And that gives you something called the partial pressure of oxygen. And that basically is what your body sees. Those masks change neither the concentration of oxygen that you're breathing nor the barometric pressure of the air that you're breathing. And therefore they do not check the partial pressure of oxygen that you're breathing. And so they do not simulate altitude in any way, shape or form. And that is, I mean, it's one thing that we get asked about a lot, and they will not prepare you for altitude in any way. They became popular because people thought they would. They don't. They might train the muscles around your lungs. They might, but in my experience and my opinion, and I couldn't say it definitively because obviously we stay away from it. They're not what we do. But for most people, that's not a limiting factor to their performance. The breathing musculature is, generally speaking, it can be, but in my experience, is generally speaking not a limitation to performance. And so that's kind of my answer to that serious answer.
Which again is just, it's kind of the science of it. It's the understanding of, and ultimately it's a logical step, right? And you can understand why people would make that mistake. And obviously the branding had something to do with it, but nevertheless, if you were to say, right, the whole idea of kind of hypoxia is we're reducing oxygen, but without getting into the nuances of what that actually means and what it is, it would logically, you just go, right, hold on. So if I put something in front of my mouth and I can't breathe as much, I'm reducing oxygen, right? So you can see where this kind of, misinterpretation has came about with it. And I think when people understand what you're actually trying to achieve, which again, when you get into, and just to touch on barometric pressure, just explain that in a little bit of a simplistic way.
Yeah, so barometric pressure is air pressure. The way that I would always think of it is, you've been in a swimming pool, right? If you dive right down to the bottom of a swimming pool, you can literally feel the weight of water pushing down on you. Right now at sea level, you have exactly the same thing, but with air. You have thousands of meters worth of air pushing down on you. And that's very high barometric pressure. You can feel that pressure at the bottom of the swimming pool. If you come up to the top of a swimming pool, you feel that pressure dissipate because you've got less water pushing down on you. As you go up in terms of altitude, same thing happens. You've got less air on top of you, so it's lower pressure.
Until eventually you float, right?
Yeah, until eventually you float, and you get into space, basically, I guess, at that point,
In theory, right? So hence why sprinters were performing better, right? Even though it's only marginal for a sprint performer, a smidgen of anything could be half a second or whatever it might be. It's it's
not even, exactly. Absolutely.
Huge. So what are so you said about health benefits, we touched on kind of the elderly, the load bearing, which I think is a massive one. I think that's a big barrier, particularly as people get older or people get injured or whatever it might be. And particularly running, walking, all those things there, it's about 3 times your body weight, isn't it? It goes through your ankle, then your knee, then your hip, then your spinal cord, and all these different things. So you've got all of this pressure that's occurring, and you can offset that and kind of take it away to some degree and provide an environment where it's more forgiving. And my head was going at that point thinking, what if you could put a tent over a swimming pool and then all of a sudden you start to get into this, this whole environment that is taking a load away from Johnson. Anyways. So,
well, you say that, but it's been done in Australia.
Yeah.
In Australia, there's a great video on YouTube, just a short one, swimming at altitude. Yeah, it's a load of those generators just pumping hypoxic air into a tent that goes over a swimming pool. Fascinating. I really recommend your viewers have a quick watch. That's only a couple of minutes, but just on YouTube. Yeah.
So does that impact the water pressure? This is me.
No,
this is me with my very basic, physics and biology understanding, but it doesn't affect water pressure. So if you were to put a pool up at 8,000 meters, the water pressure wouldn't change.
Water pressure at 8,000 meters, I don't know, my physics isn't that good, to be honest with you, but the point is that it's simulated altitude, so there's no change in pressure anyway.
No, sorry,
whenever we're simulating altitude, we're not changing pressure, so there's nothing like that. It's literally just the water stays the same, but every time they take a breath, only 15% of the air they're breathing is oxygen versus 21% of the air normally. That's the only change.
Sorry, I'm throwing out some completely hypothetical scenarios. Nobody's ever going to want to know. It's like, let's put a pool at the top of Everest. Let's build a massive cave. Heads going all over the place. So advancements. So what are we seeing? So your typical environment that you put people into, what is it simulating? You said you go up to about 6,500. Is that right? 6,500.
Yeah,
not the limit for a human being. Yeah. So where do you normally? So if I was going to a hypoxic chamber tomorrow that you have, Do you set that pressure based on how experienced I am or how trained I am in those environments, or do you have a kind of a standard that you start at and then you build up tolerance by spending more time in it?
Yeah, pretty much. So our altitude chamber is set at 2,700 meters. Most will be between 2,700 and 3,000 meters. That's about 15% oxygen.
Yep.
And that basically is the right balance between getting a benefit from being at altitude, but not being so high that you can't train. And bear in mind that this is a group training environment. So within our chamber, we've got 4 treadmills, we've got 5 or 6 watt bikes, rowing machine. We do circuit sessions in there, that sort of thing. So we have people in there in a group. So that's well tolerated by anyone. And we'll do most of our exercise in there. The only time we'll take people up is if they're either doing very light exercise for the purposes of climatizing to higher altitude. So if we've got someone who's going to 5, 6, 7, 8,000 meters, then we might have them exercise, and we'll do that in a one-to-one basis. And then we can actually monitor their response, as you say, and create progressive overload through altitude as much as through, your normal principles of overload. Or we'll do it completely passively. So actually we'll remove exercise from the equation completely and just have people breathing very high altitude air, which could be up to 6,500 meters high. And that's basically to get the benefits of altitude, again, whether that's for pre-acclimatization, whether that's for health, whether that's to encourage recovery on a rest day or during a taper or during a phase of injury. Then we'll do that at very high altitude, but remove the exercise from it completely.
So tell me about injury, because this is an interesting one, isn't it? So tell me about injury and hypoxic sort of simulation.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it's something that we're doing a lot of work in that space at the moment, both in terms of putting together research, but actually in the applied space as well. And it's how we're seeing a lot of football clubs using altitude training at the moment is in the injury rehabilitation test. And I think to understand that, you kind of need to look at the different phases of injury rehab. So we would generally have a player or an athlete who is in a position where they can't load, whether that's complete phase of deloading or their, best case scenario, maybe doing some cross training. So if we can have them doing that type of training where they're literally just breathing high altitude air, then we know that that's good for bone regeneration, for example. We think it's probably pretty good for muscle, ligament and tendon injuries as well, just to accelerate the rate of healing of those. And we've had some really good results, particularly, as I say, around bony injuries, and accelerating the return to a point where they can then tolerate loading. And if we then progress people through, then it's looking at a lot of the same principles again, really. And what I was saying about the the people, perhaps the older people or the overweight people who can't load, where you've got the same situation with an athlete who's injured or returning to fitness. You can't have them running on a treadmill at the speed they'd usually be running at. So why don't we have them walking on a treadmill or running at a slower pace, or doing some cross training work, doing that at altitude and getting a greater cardiometabolic load for it than if they were doing it at sea level. Same with resistance training. If there's going to be a phase of time where they're just reduced to doing banded work, or they can only lift very light weights, and then there's good research to show that actually you can lift as little as 20% of your 1 rep max at altitude and still get meaningful improvements in cross-sectional area and muscle strength, which is really cool if you're an injured athlete. And then taking that right through to the point at which they're cleared to return to full training, because ultimately we can accelerate the rate of muscle growth, we can accelerate the rate of cardiovascular fitness improvement in that kind of final phase. So between the point at which they're cleared to load and the point at which they're returning to play, we can actually reduce that phase quite considerably. If we can do that by a couple of weeks at each phase, then we're suddenly actually returning an athlete to the field of play or the track or whatever it is much more quickly than if they didn't have any access to environmental stresses at all.
Wow. So is there much data kicking around with respect to people who naturally live at these environments? I mean, you look at data with respect to dietary differentials, you look at data with respect to people's access to the outdoors, weather, climate, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously this is a climate kind of issue, is that you've got people who live permanently at 5,000 feet or whatever it might be, 5,000 meters, sorry. And what are we seeing there? Is there a bunch of data that's telling us certain conditions are less prevalent? Their stroke volume, their VO2, their, what are these numbers looking like? Has there been any studies on these?
No, not in terms of injury, because injury epidemiology is hard to do in that respect. To be honest with you, those are very hard studies to run. We've got good data on that from as far back as the 70s and 80s on cardiovascular risk factors and cancers and things like that, and health outcomes. And we know that health outcomes are better for populations who live at altitude versus living at sea level. Even when you control for things like socioeconomic status, the fact that people who are living at altitude might be more inclined, particularly at that time, might be more involved in outdoor activities. Even when you control for those sorts of things, there's something there in those health behaviors. But when it comes to injury, no, what we can look at these things in a couple of ways. A lot of it comes from kind of benchtop studies where actually, got bone cells in a culture. And actually what we can do is we can do two things. We can either basically simulate it so that these cells are at altitude the whole time. And if we do that, then we see that actually the bone that forms is far more dense after 38 days than the bone that is kept at sea level. Or we can do the reverse. We can actually give them, lots of oxygen and take away the hypoxia, and that bone that forms is far less dense. So it's kind of from that sort of data that we get those mechanistic understandings. But then also just from the way that we see it applied. And I think this is one area, again, where the application is ahead of the science. And actually, we're just seeing from the way that we're integrating it with, with Premier League football clubs, for example, and they're actually returning players to the pitch far more quickly than they would expect to. And we've seen that in ourselves as well. This time last year, personally, I'm a runner. I was dealing with shin splints. I had a stress fracture in my left tibia, and I was back running, within a couple of months in a way that I wouldn't expect to have done otherwise, just from having access to altitude a lot of the time. Sleeping at altitude to retain cardiovascular fitness, but also having these short exposures to altitude to improve bone healing. So it's kind of through that side of things, and then we're starting to piece together some of the mechanisms to understand why that might be the case as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're verging on the kind of superhuman traits where you've got people with stronger bones. They've got better muscular adaptation, they've got better tolerance of oxygen, and all of these things. And they all seem to favor being at altitude. They all, everything seems to be a positive. Now on that note, what are the negatives to it?
Yeah, look, I think one of the big reasons that people develop this idea of sleeping in an altitude tent but training still at sea level is that with that initial live high, train high approach, people would go to let's say St. Moritz for 4, 5, 6 weeks. The main drawback to that is firstly cost. Let's be frank, that's a very expensive time to spend away if you're an individual athlete, let alone if you're a team.
Yep.
But the other thing is that with extended periods of time at altitude, there's a potential for the quality of training to drop. So there are some types of training where if you're doing, for example, VO2 max type training, you need a good amount of oxygen flux. You need to be getting lots of oxygen from your lungs into your blood, into your muscle at one time. And that high quality training that runners and cyclists do. And sometimes if athletes are not able to train at quite the right altitude, or they're particularly susceptible to altitude and they go to camp for the first time, then they might be unable to achieve that quality of work. So the top end might drop off. And so that's why we've developed this idea of sleeping in an altitude tent, because you can still accumulate plenty of time at altitude to get the endurance adaptations that you want, the improved red blood cell count, that sort of thing. But you can step outside, train at sea level, and retain the quality of training. So that's really traditionally been the biggest drawback of altitude training, but actually it's very easily overcome with good planning if someone is going to altitude, and good preparation, but also by using this live high, train low approach rather than actually going to the mountains at all.
Yeah, and it seems to open it up to an awful lot more people. I mean, it's, back in the day, when I'd finished my degree, there was a lot of athletes at that point were considering, off-season stuff. They'd go to, various islands and things like this just to train at altitude. I mean, Hawaii was always quite a reasonably popular one. I remember watching the Ironman there, and the amount of athletes that actually got hit by, which I guess it wasn't a huge, altitude challenge, but the slight alteration, I think, throughout the entire Ironman was quite significant. And
yeah, look, I mean, with Hawaii, because we prepare a lot of athletes to go to Kona for the Ironman World Champs, but for that it's mostly around the heat and humidity is the real challenge there. So actually, more so, we see people going off to altitude. If they want to go to Tenerife, that's a really popular one with cyclists, particularly. I'm thinking of islands, but yeah, places like Sierra Nevada, San Moritz, Fon Romeu in Europe. Obviously, Iten in Kenya is massive, but that's the home of endurance running, right? But then in the States, places like Flagstaff, people go to these places and it's great, and they get good training camp effects and all the rest of it. But as you say, one of the really interesting things that you said there actually was doing it in off season. And I think it's one of the things that the elite athletes, they do really well, is they periodize their use of altitude training. Because it's not just altitude, but it's what you do while you're there that's so important. You can't just go to altitude and expect to get fit. You still have to put the work in, so you have to be well prepared, you have to train well. So actually, we'll see, and there's a really interesting narrative review which came out a couple of years ago, which is just about how elite athletes periodize their use of altitude training and how they plan for the long term. So between Olympics, within an Olympic cycle, between Olympic Games, they'll be planning their use of altitude training. They'll go in a base period and just do loads of volume potentially, and then they'll go down to sea level to train, get some quality up, and then prepare for when their next camp is. Because if we can repeatedly use altitude training, and periodize it well, then actually we can reduce that kind of drop off in performance that I was talking about and get a higher quality of training in there. And so actually it comes down to planning and what you do when you're at altitude as much as the altitude itself. You still have to understand your fundamentals of sports science, but just through the vessel of altitude training, really.
And I'm guessing the adaptation, the adaptation doesn't last forever, right? It's it's a bit like a lot of training methods and modalities that have existed. I mean, there's some super temporal ones, which are things like overspeed and things like this, which is just an immediate response that you get. But obviously with altitude training, you can't just swan off, do a year's worth of altitude training, then return and expect that just to last forever, right? If you return back to sea level. So how long we're looking at with respect to, somebody, how long would somebody need to train, let's say for a triathlon or whatever it might be? And how long would they need to train for? And when would their last training altitude be in order for them to be able to carry that over into a race or an event?
I mean, this is just the question in altitude training, and the honest answer is that it's quite individual for anyone, because with regards to the timing of kind of coming down from altitude or coming out the altitude tent or whatever, it's a bit more straightforward if you're living low and training high. So the type of training that we do at the altitude centre in London, and people can do at home as well with the generators, you can really be doing that up to the day before your event, because that just comes down to how you're managing your load. And actually, if you can continue doing altitude training during a taper, then you keep getting the benefits of being at altitude, but you can have a lower mechanical load and musculoskeletal load during a taper. So you feel fresher, but you're still getting the benefits of doing your taper workouts. So kind of live low, train high. That's not really so much of a question. Just use it straight through. But when it comes to any kind of living high, whether that's sleeping in an altitude tent or being in mountains, it's a bit more nuanced. And often what we'd encourage people to do is to have a particular workout that's important to them and they can gauge their fitness on. And then we can actually have kind of dummy runs basically while they're sleeping in the tent. So if someone's sleeping in an altitude tent, they've got a big A race, they're going to the Ironman World Championships, for example, and they want to hire a tent, and they, we say, look, actually, you're best off doing that for 3-4 months, something like that. And within that time that you've got access to, let's have a couple of runs, let's practice, let's have you sleep in a tent for 4 weeks. At that point, do a fitness test so you can understand how you fare when you're actually sleeping in a tent. And then when you do that fitness test, then come out of the tent for a couple of weeks, and then we'll understand how that affects you as well. Because there are some adaptations which are quite immediate, and you'll get the most out of those pretty much the day after you stop using your tent. There are some adaptations which take a couple of weeks to develop. And then there's likely to be some residual fatigue, either from altitude, from not sleeping so well, or from a training camp itself. If you go to an altitude training camp, you're probably doing harder training as well. So there might be some fatigue there. And so it's so many factors all coming together that you've got to time correctly. For most people, that's between 1 and 2 weeks after coming down from altitude that they get their peak performance. But it's really individual. And that's one of the things that actually, we're really keen to stress, is that it's important to get it right for you. We can look at all the research, but we need to understand the individual approach correctly as well.
Yeah. So we talk about living high. So what happens when, even on a genetic level, if I've got somebody who's lived high, or their grandparents lived high, their parents lived high, they lived high for most of their formative years, and then they reacclimatize, they go to sea level, and they live at sea level for the rest of their days. Is there any kind of carryover there that is permanent? Anything that they adapt to genetically? Is there something that we can see? Obviously we know things with muscle fiber types and various other bits and pieces, but is there something there that's carrying over? So when we look at somebody like Nims, he's got, he's Nepalese, there's going to be a history of, family members, even himself. I can't recall how long he'd actually lived at altitude for, but is there carryover there?
Yeah, there will be. But what you kind of have to appreciate as well is that when we're talking about altitude populations, you're dealing with evolutionary time, which is massive. So we're not dealing with 2-3 generations. We're dealing with, this is history and history and history. And what seems to have happened, and we're still trying to understand this exactly, but what seems to have happened is that high altitude populations in different parts of the world have adapted to altitude in different ways. So 3 main altitude populations which have been studied. You've got those in East Africa, you've got those in Nepal, and you've got those in South America. And they've all, it seems, and again, I'm not a geneticist, it's not fully my area, so I don't want to say anything that's incorrect, but essentially they've kind of adapted to altitude in slightly different ways. Some of them with the classical increase in red blood cell count, which is what you'd expect if you have a lowlander going to high altitude for a short period of time. You'd expect their red blood cell count to increase. Some of them have basically developed an ability whereby the blood going through the lungs slows down more than normal people. So although they don't have more blood, they're able to load up their blood with lots of oxygen. So they don't have more blood cells, but they're able to carry more oxygen on every single blood cell that they have. And the third group seem to have developed kind of their way of breathing. So they kind of hyperventilate a little bit more than other people. And I forget off the top of my head is the honest answer exactly which way around that is, but those are kind of the 3 main altitude populations which have been studied. And genetically, they seem to have adapted slightly differently. That's different to if we have a lowlander, so someone who's, take me, I'm from London. My family's been from London since the year dot. No kind of altitude heritage, as it were. If I were to go to altitude, sleep in an altitude tent, go to Iten in Kenya, I would respond very classically with an increase in red blood cell count. And that kind of carries over for a shorter period of time on return to sea level, because having a lot of red blood cells is quite costly. And so what happens eventually is that the body basically gets rid of any red blood cells that it doesn't need. Eventually that adaptation does die off.
And that is in essence, and again, to touch on a kind of very grey area, but that's essentially how blood doping works, right?
Yeah, let's just go with yeah. Again, there's a little bit more nuance to it than that, but yes.
And you still have to work hard, being able to carry more oxygen, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay. We'll maybe chat to a cyclist about that one day, but
yeah.
It's fascinating. I mean, it opens whole myriads, and obviously you guys are focused on one particular, which is altitude. It's that the high and the low, and the various ways in which you can do that, whether you live or you train, or a combination of both, which is really interesting. But obviously there are, and again, this is why I was kind of touching on the, what happens if you go down, what happens if you keep going up, and all these different things. And we've got actually one of our ambassadors, Dr. Phil Price. He's doing some work with the Space Center right now, and they're doing some stuff with loading and how load affects in zero gravity fundamentally. So I guess it's an nth degree of that. So if we look at, again, different populations, so there's a couple of things there that sounded almost a little contradictory, which was that if you had somebody who was looking at muscular adaptation, so obviously we've got this stuff about, there's data about injury, and obviously, cross-sectional area, et cetera, et cetera. But if you've got somebody who's actually trying to build muscle tissue, so bog standard hypertrophy, we're not talking strength, we're talking about muscular size. So if you've got somebody who's wanted to pursue aesthetic benefits to weight training, because I always think this is a really interesting population, because it's a very bizarre thing to try and get your muscles to do. Normally it would be a byproduct of strength training that over time the muscles would get bigger, et cetera, et cetera. But now we have this distinct population that just chases muscular size and muscular cross-sectional area. And what we find is with a lot of these performance modalities, things like, contrast work, ice particularly, we were talking about just the other week, and it doesn't influence that population positively. So how would altitude affect somebody who is pursuing that kind of outcome? Do you know, or is it kind of a bit of a grey area?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a grey area, because in practice it's not really done all that much. There's a massive gym just been built in Poland, which is all at altitude, but for the most part altitude chambers are quite small, and we generally kit them out to go for endurance type athletes. They're usually with bikes and treadmills, and we do circuit training in there because we want our athletes to be doing strength work, but it's not generally looking for aesthetics. So in practice it's not really done. Look, if I look at the literature on it, I think there is no reason that it shouldn't be done, because aesthetic, I'm not a personal trainer in that respect, but aesthetics kind of comes down to having a good amount of muscle and not a lot of fat, pretty much, if we break it down to make it very simple. And altitude is useful for getting rid of fat and building muscle. So yeah, look, I see it as being a good thing, because one of the very useful things, or one of the stimuli for muscle size adaptation, is going to be hypoxia within the muscle. And things like lactate production as well. And we know that we put our muscles through greater metabolic stress when we do resistance training at altitude versus when we do it at sea level. So we can increase lactate production, we can increase the degree of hypoxia within the muscle by doing it at altitude versus at sea level. So I don't see any reason not to do it. More just that from a practical point of view, it hasn't been done, because up to this point, generally altitude training has been geared towards endurance athletes. I think that's the only reason it hasn't been done. But in terms of the research, I don't see anything that says it shouldn't be good for aesthetics. No.
Interesting. And obviously with the blood flow, we've actually got one of our upcoming guests is actually an expert on blood flow restriction, which is a form of. So, and
Yeah.
you touched on before about ultimately you go into an altitude chamber or a hypoxia environment, you're essentially doing blood flow restriction to everything, right? You know, it's this
Yeah,
whole.
it's one of the it's the best way that I had it actually described back to me. And part of my role is going around to football clubs and educating them on how to use it. And one of the SNCs, one of the clubs just said, "Oh, so it's like whole body blood flow restriction training." I was like, "Well, yeah, I guess in many ways it is when you look at it from a resistance training point of view. Yeah, you just create systemic hypoxia rather than localized hypoxia."
Interesting. Yeah, no, it's so I guess you're kind of there, aren't you, with the science? There's there's a lot of things which are evolving. Obviously, there's things that can get better, and there's things you can do better, and I guess really in your field, it's more, I guess, transporting it or making it accessible to people. So I'm thinking away here. I'm thinking, how costly would it be, and how easy would it be to turn my gym into a hypoxic gym as well at the same time. So I guess a lot of the evolution, I guess, with it and the progression in your field is how can you make this more accessible to more people? Or is there an evolution? Is there a way of making altitude training better?
I think I think one of the big things is accessibility, and that's kind of the point of altitude training, really. And whereas once it was this thing for elite athletes, I think hopefully, through this conversation, we're able to demonstrate that it is for everybody. So it's making it accessible to everybody. Is one of the big things. I think the evolution in that respect then comes from understanding how it interacts in different sports. And so one of the big explosions of research and use that we've seen probably in the last, when would it have been 2013? So in the last 9 years or so, has been in team sports and repeat type sports. So anything where you have to sprint all out for short periods of time, have an incomplete recovery and go again. So it started off mostly in football, but we see it in combat sports because it follows the same pattern, similar pattern, racket sports, those sorts of things. And that repeat sprint ability, that's been a massive area of growth in the last 9-10 years or so. So I think actually we're seeing it just applied in more sports. And I think as more sports have access to better sports science, we'll understand how to then integrate altitude into that. So, we've been doing some work recently with, Olympic sailors, for example, who previously haven't necessarily had as much sports science support as they might have done, but now they have. They understand the needs of the sport. They've done their needs analysis of the sport, and we can actually break it down and go, well, you need a good VO2 max, you need good endurance, you need good abilities to recover, you need good strength. Bam, this is how we do our altitude training and integrate it within that. So I think just as more sports start to operate at that level, we'll see altitude start to be integrated more within those sports as well.
Yeah, I guess out of all the sports, they're the ones that most definitely aren't going to be trained above sea level, right? It's
yeah, exactly. Right. But yeah.
So it's and I think that carryover is interesting into different sports. I always like to throw hypertrophy or muscle building into the mix because there's so many of these techniques and things like this where that throws an anomaly because it's a very different pursuance of a different physiological outcome, one that isn't always accompanied with necessarily strength and size and blah blah blah. So it's always an interesting one. So what are you guys doing at the moment? So Altitude Center as a whole, is it general population? Have you got any projects that you can talk about? Are there any things that you're doing at the moment that are super exciting or that are emerging in the field of altitude training?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few strands to what we do as a business. We've got our altitude chamber on site, which we operate as a gym for anybody to use if they're looking for improved endurance performance. We work with a lot of team sports athletes on site. Mountaineers is a really big one. As the world starts to open up again, there's a massive appetite to climb Kilimanjaro, Everest Base Camp, things in the Alps, Pyrenees. I think, as you said, 14 peaks has really captured people's imagination. They want to go and do that. So we're training a lot of people for 7,000-8,000 meter peaks in April, but lower than that as well. So we have all of that going on site. We do a lot of work installing altitude chambers, either in private gyms or in training grounds of football clubs. Run training camps for rugby teams, that sort of thing. So a lot in the team sports space as well. and people having the equipment to use at home as well. You know, the generators that have said, you know, obviously we're based in London, but not everyone can get to London, so we're all about making it accessible to people to do at home. You know, people in Manchester still want to go and climb Kilimanjaro, so they need to be able to pre-acclimatise at home. There's no point me telling them to come down to London 4 times a week. So you know, we're doing that as well. So a lot of that is starting to happen, and as the world's starting to open up again, you know, we've got a lot of clients going off and climbing, which is very exciting. We're working, you know, now with a lot of kind of up and coming athletes. Sort of, for example, in the marathon space, you know, Britain's fastest marathoner at London this year. We're working with both, you know, providing equipment, but also then expertise as he goes off to Kenya to do his training camps. Okay, how are these things being, you know, how are you actually looking at your training when you're in Kenya, those sorts of things to do that. But really, it's the whole ethos of the Altitude Centre and kind of the project that we're working on continuously is just bringing that expertise and the equipment that has previously been for elite athletes and just making it accessible for anyone who's looking to improve their performance. Anybody can be serious about performance or health and well-being. Anybody, it doesn't matter what level you're operating at. That's very much a mindset thing, how serious you are about it. And if you're serious about it, then you can be getting more from it with altitude. And so we want to just apply that expertise and that knowledge that we have to be working with anyone who wants to, really.
Amazing. And you have how many locations?
So we've only got the one location. We're in London. We're in Bank, for those that know London well. But as I say, we have the equipment that people are using at home across the world, literally, at the moment.
Cool. So if people want to get in touch or people want to, you know, capitalize on those services, you know, rent units out or whatever it might be, or get a chamber built, you know, how do they go about doing that? Is it just a matter of, you know, jumping on the website, dropping you a line? Or...
Yeah, absolutely. So we're online, we're altitudecentre.com, and we're on all the usual social media channels of the Altitude Centre or at Altitude Centre. You can find us across Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the rest of it. Yeah.
Cool. And then you've got, there's a decent team down there, isn't there? There's quite a few of you.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a small team, but we're all experienced within altitude and within our different respects. So my role is as lead performance specialist, so just kind of overseeing things, but more so with high out, you know, 7,000-8,000 meter peaks and running. My colleague Nick, who you've spoken to, is a really, really strong cyclist. So he coaches a lot of guys with cycling. He's had some awesome results over the last 12 months in terms of the guys he coaches. Our centre manager Sam, he's a football player himself to a good standard. Just loves altitude training. We take on interns each year as well. We've got Tiona at the moment, and she's getting into cycling and doing that. So yeah, it's a good team with varied experience, but with common goals, should we say?
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to take us through altitude training, because again, it is a little bit of a funny area in that there's not that many people doing it out there to the same capacity that you guys are.
Yeah.
And obviously it's of interest, I think, to a lot of people. And I think, you know, breaking down a few of the myths about it, particularly things like the masks and etc., and just understanding a little bit more about what the adaptations are and what the benefits are is great. So thank you so much for taking the time, James. I know we're kind of in holiday time for a lot of people right now, but yeah, are you back in just yet? Are you?
No, we'll be back open from the 4th or whatever the Tuesday is after bank holiday, and then it'll be all hands to deck as we start moving into climbing season, marathon season, triathlons, all the rest of it. It'll be all hands to deck from there, really.
Amazing. And then all of those seasons, they kind of overlap, don't they? There's a lot of, so I guess there's some busy periods for you, is there?
Yeah, that's right. We'll have people going to the Himalayas, if you know, kind of from April onwards, and we'll have people running marathons during that time, and that's when triathlons start happening. And yeah, it's all year round, really. There's always someone doing something that you want to be getting in on, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you're a cyclist, I know that. So you've done some quite serious cycling sort of feats, and skiing as well, yeah.
Yeah, skiing, cycling. I'm a runner more so now. So I've been working on running for the last year or so. So I've got a few goals for 2022, which will be trying to hit with the help of altitude training. That's for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again, James, for joining us, and this will be live in the next week or so.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much for your time, Phil. Really good to talk to you.
Take care now. All right. Bye. Cheers. For now. Bye-bye.